Probably my favorite one that I had on the list, and it's Morgan Housel, the author of The Psychology of Money. And Morgan, I told you this before we came on, and people know me out there, I'm not a BSer. Honestly, one of the probably two greatest books that any investor should ever read is your book.
I appreciate it.
I am one of the slowest readers. It will take me weeks sometimes. Yours was a weekend, and I couldn't put it down, and I've read it again since then. I've bought it for friends and family, I bought it for colleagues, I demand people read it. And I tell you folks, if you're obviously watching the show, you're probably interested in investing. If you haven't read this, please, it's gonna change your view on so many things. So first of all, thanks for writing that. I think you've done the industry a big solid there. So gave a speech today, which is great, just came off stage. But let's talk about the book for a second. What is what was the crux of that? Obviously you've been in the industry for a while. For you to write that book, what were you trying to achieve with people reading it?
I always say this thing about my writing, which is I call it selfish writing. So I'm writing for an audience of one, which is me. So I write a book about topics that I'm interested in a way that I find interesting. And then there's a leap of faith that if I think it's interesting, somebody else will too. That's very different from know your audience, which I think very commonly turns into pander to your audience. And as a reader, you know when you're being pandered to. So I always just write most of the topics in the book are things that I struggled with myself, or I wanted to learn about myself. That's really what it came from. I almost feel like it's a diary that I published in some ways.
So how did you get into this industry? How did you start out to even doing this? Were you a writer first? Were you in the investment side?
All throughout college, I wanted to be an investment banker or a hedge fund manager, as a lot of people did during that era. And then I graduated college in 2008 when the world was falling to pieces, nobody was hiring. So I took a job as a financial writer at the Motley Fool. I never had any intention or desire or interest in being a writer, but I took a job, I needed a job. There was only people who were hiring back then, but I fell in love with it. I fell in love with the process of writing. And I like being an outsider in the sense that I'm not a fund manager, I'm not a financial advisor, I'm also not a journalist. I'm just kind of an investor who's has a perch of looking at what's going on in the world, and I try to learn something from it and share it with other people.
You know, the way you come across, it's very digestible. Because you said you're not some guy who's trying to talk down and say, I'm smarter than you, I'm talking down to it. You're talking to it as if you're talking to the average investor out there. And we have several hundred of our subscribers here, and most of them are average investors. So you kind of really relate to that, and I think that's most investors. So what's the one topic that people come to you, read the book, and say, listen, you've changed my life, or this changed my investing?
I think there's two that stick out from the book that were most important to me too. One is using money to control your time. And I think that's the highest dividend that money can pay, is just the ability to wake up every morning and say, I can do whatever I want today. It gives you a sense of independence and autonomy. And that is so different from using money to buy something nice, to buy a new car, to buy a new house. By the way, I like nice stuff. It's not against that stuff. But if you can use your money as a tool for independence, that is, I think, the highest value that it can provide for most people. That's the first one. The second idea from the book that was really important for me is the idea of reasonable versus rational, which is just the idea that we are not perfectly rational people. We should not expect to make rational decisions all the time. If you can just make reasonable decisions with your money, that's the best that we can do. So too many people are trying to pull out the spreadsheet and calculate what they should do down to the 5th decimal place. It's no, just do something reasonable. As long as it's not completely unreasonable. So if you have a small part of your money that you're day trading with, if it's a small part and you like doing it, if it's reasonable, go for it. So reasonable versus rational, I think is really important for me as well.
I love that. And your first point, there was a speaker here a couple of years ago, Mr. Wonderful, the guy from Shark Tank. And of course his persona on air is kind of arrogant, but he was actually a great speaker, spoke to him outdoors. But he said something that really resonated with me. I've been an entrepreneur now for over 20 years. It's people don't become entrepreneurs to become wealthy and rich. It's for the freedom. The same thing, the independence. You want that freedom and independence. Money does make you happy, but if it allows you to spend more time with your children or go see your family or travel or hike or whatever it is you want to do, that's happiness. So that's really important to understand when you're investing.
And what's really important too is that when money allows you to do that, it's when it's money that you haven't spent. It's wealth that you've saved up and have not spent. So the money that makes you independent is the car that you didn't buy. It's the house you didn't buy. It's the trip you didn't take. I'm not saying you shouldn't do those things, but it's wealth that you've saved up and not spent that gives you a sense of freedom and autonomy to just wake up and live the life that you want to live.
It's a nice way to wake up, isn't it?
It is.
So you talked about the Psychology of Money, the name of the book, obviously. I don't know if you ever read a book. I read it back then. It's called Come Into My Trading Room by Dr. Alexander Elder.
No.
So he was a psychologist and a day trader, which was a kind of a weird match. And he took both sides of it. And I thought of that book when I was reading yours because the psychology of a human, this is my view. I think most investors have no idea how to make money in the stock market, and they defeat themselves the moment they sit down.
Yeah.
Because they have these like irrational thoughts of how much money they should make.
Yeah.
And I'm a long-term investor, but they sell in 3 months.
Yeah.
So how do you speak to people to really not defeat yourself?
I think the first thing people need to do is look in the mirror and kind of have a conversation with themselves about who they are. And I think a big core of the book is just becoming more introspective. We're all so different. How I think about risk is not how you think about risk. Even if we're very similar people, everyone has their own baggage that they bring to the table. So analyzing your own history, your own baggage, what you want out of money is really important. Everyone assumes that there's one right answer to investing. And if you can find that one right answer, it's the right answer for me and you and everyone. And I think it's just not like that. It's closer to like a taste in music where you like country, I like this. Like everyone has a different taste in it. And so I think figuring out what game you're trying to play, what your goals are, what your risk tolerance is, that's the most important thing. And I think most financial problems come from, or most financial debates of two people arguing over, should you buy this stock? Is the economy a mess? Like people, they're not actually debates. It's people with different risk tolerance and different time horizons talking over each other.
Exactly.
And so once you figure out what game you're playing and who you are, what you want out of money, I think a lot of those things clear up.
What's the one advice you give your friends and family that come to you and maybe they're a new investor or they've struggled investing or they're fed up with the industry and they want to do it themselves? I'm sure you get questions all the time. What is the one bit of advice that you give those investors?
I think other than like being introspective about who you are, it's bringing a sense of humility to the table. Most investing problems come from a lack of humility or just an overestimation of your own individual skills in investing. Yeah. And everyone knows, if you were to say like, I want to become a professional NBA player, everyone knows it's like, okay, 99.9% chance you're not going to make it. It's hard. It's supposed to be hard. That's why they're so entertaining. But when people say, I want to beat the market, I want to become one of the best investors, there is a sense that roughly everyone should be able to do it. And I think it's just as hard. So when you see the statistics about 90% of mutual funds underperform their benchmark, some people use that as an indication of like, oh, the fund management business is a scam. I view it as an indication of like, it's supposed to be hard. Yeah. There's no world in which everybody who tries to beat the market should be able to do it. So I think bringing that sense of humility about how difficult it can be is really important.
I love that because, I ran money for almost 20 years at an RIA I sold a couple years ago, and people come to me, and I did more of the stock picking, and they're like, wow, this mutual fund, I'm like, that's a person, a woman or man or team that's managed your money. You have no idea, you never spoke to them, but you're trusting your money with them, and your odds are 1 in 10 that they're gonna beat the market with low fees. That's like sitting down at a blackjack table and having, 10% odds of winning.
And having no fun doing it.
Yeah, exactly.
With no free drinks.
Exactly. It doesn't end well. I know you got to run and you're a busy man. Before I let you go, I ask all my guests this question. I call it the island question. If I were to say you and your family, you get to take a break from your speeches and writing and put them on an island for 10 years, maybe it's an island off the coast of Seattle, but you have them for 10 years. What's the one investment, and you don't have to pick a stock or anything, is there an asset class or something that you'd feel good with putting your money in for those 10 years?
See, I'm a dollar cost average into index funds kind of guy. That's how I invest, which makes it like fits perfectly into that scenario.
Yes.
Because even though I'm not on the island for 10 years, that's kind of how I think about my investments. Like there's no following the economy or the stock market or interest rates that would necessarily change how I invest. It is just buy a slice of capitalism with the idea that I can leave it alone for 50 years on the proverbial island.
And that 50-year time frame rolling, there's never been any time in history that the market wasn't up.
There could be. That's not to say it can't happen.
I can say it can't happen. I just feel if we get into a scenario like that, there's probably other things to worry about than our money.
Yes, in the scenario in which the stock market is down over 50 years, you're probably not going to worry that much about you're going to be worrying about social collapse.
Exactly.
And you're not going to want gold or Bitcoin. You're going to want guns and ammunition and penicillin.
Exactly. And that's why a lot of those commercials late night, they sell that stuff and people are buying it. So, hey, Morgan, again, it was a pleasure. Thanks for coming on. Again, thanks for writing a book, one of the best books I've had. Please, folks, get out there and get it. The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. We'll be back with a lot more interviews coming out throughout the day. I'm Matt McCall, and that was Making Money.